Welcome to the Stir It Up podcast, where our purpose is to encourage, challenge, lift up, and stir up the body of Christ to love and good works.
Well, welcome back, everyone. I'm Michelle Dowdy.
And I'm Starla Harbin.
And we're here in the Rivercrest Studios in Gainesville, Georgia, nestled in the foothills of Northeast Georgia. And it's actually a rainy day here in Georgia today. And we're hoping that these April rains will wash away all this record-setting pollen that we have had.
Yes.
So
since 2012.
So, if you can see the air you're breathing in, it's not good. So we hope it'll wash it away. But, so we're here. Mark Dowdy is here with us again as our engineer. So we're thankful for that. And
Absolutely.
We have a very special guest with us here today. So, Starla, would you like to introduce our very special guest?
So we have a one-of-a-kind guest today. It's my husband, Russ Harbin. Most of us know him as Pastor Russ. We've been married for 31 years, soon to be 32 in May. And we have 2 children. And we met in 1991, and Russ was preaching, and I was singing for a conference, a Disciple Now, at Roswell Street Baptist Church in Marietta, Georgia. And the sparks flew, and here we are. And we've been in ministry. He's been in ministry about 39 years, and I'm the same because we started as teenagers in 2 separate states. But the Lord brought us together, and we've been able to do ministry now for all of these years together. And so Russ has a very special testimony and how the Lord has touched his life over the years and drawn him to himself. And so I'm thankful today for his willingness to jump in here and share his testimony and really what the Lord has done over the span of his life.
And we could do a whole another episode on marriage and ministry and how all that. So there are lots of things we could talk about, but we're glad to have you here today with us as my pastor and Starla's pastor too, I guess.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Well, the sparks still fly.
They're still flying. That's so good. Well, we want to go back, I guess, to the very beginning, even though we're going to be talking a lot about the church now and the church plant and what you're doing now, but we want to kind of go back to your beginning, which I know a lot of your story, but just kind of take us back to when you were a child and started in those school years and you started having some difficulty with learning and especially reading in those times, and you talk a lot about that. So just give us a little snapshot
there. Sure. I grew up with 2 siblings. I'm the middle child, and which is always said I was the peanut butter between the bread that gave the flavor. and so, but I struggled early on, and I didn't know I struggled until others started telling me how much I struggled. And of course, I couldn't read, and I noticed that very early on that I couldn't read and didn't know how to read, and couldn't pronounce things, and having difficulty looking at things and even comprehending things. And so that was a real struggle for me as I started off as a small child. And really, they had a class called Readiness that was in between first grade and kindergarten and first grade.
Yeah.
And I don't know why they called it Readiness because I wasn't ready for anything. But that's what they called it, and that's where they assigned me to that class, and it really didn't work, but I struggled a lot because I couldn't read, and I was treated differently because of that. And I had people, obviously, one of the reasons back then they put me in a class with mentally handicapped children, and so that started off for me a difficult time because I knew I was different because other people told me that, but really it began to almost make me feel shameful at the same time because I couldn't read.
Right. Well, and you have told me about this one particular thing that a teacher did involving a refrigerator box. The box.
The box.
Tell us about the box.
Well, it was quite clever. I mean, of course, I couldn't do as the other students, and that was sit still. I couldn't sit still, and I used it a lot of things that I did was out of a protection, and it was protecting me from others knowing what I couldn't do, and so the teacher was clever, and she brought in a refrigerator box, and she put a chair in it and faced it to the back. And
Now this was a cardboard box back then.
Yeah,
Some people
cardboard.
think you're talking about like a cold refrigerator.
No,
This
just
was
the box.
the box that it
box
came
that
in.
came
if that would have been the case, you'd end up on Dateline. So that
Freezing
was not-
little Russell
Russell in the
freeze- yes, freezing little Russell. And that probably would have worked, but I had so she put this box, and during reading time, and we were getting together in a circle, I would have to sit still, and of course I couldn't. And she would say, "Russell, go to the box." Well, I was tired of going to the box without windows. And so I came up with a plan to make some windows. So I brought a knife to school, a steak knife, and it was time to go to the box. And so I cut me out a couple of windows and stuck my head back out through the windows. So her little box, or her big box, because it was a big box, but it just had a door and no windows.
So think about the creativity of a child, cutting windows in his box, and yet they were putting him in the box. So
Well, and think about the fact that he put that kitchen knife in his pocket. It had to be sticking out because he was 6 years old and his garanimals or whatever. And the
I
end of
didn't
that
wear garanimals.
handle had to be sticking out, so no one ever noticed the kitchen knife in his pocket. So I thought it was
Well,
kind of
strange.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, you try to be protective of what you need to do. I did what I needed to do.
Right, you tried to hide. Maybe you
I
put it in
did.
your little. Maybe you put it in your lunchbox or something.
I don't know where I put it.
Yeah,
I think it
don't
was in my
remember.
pocket,
Yeah, in your
my
pocket.
jeans, my Buster Brown, with those
Your dungarees.
Yeah,
is
your
what you
dungarees,
say.
yeah.
dungarees. I've never heard of dungarees.
You haven't?
No.
That's what my grandmother always said.
Okay, you're asking me about your grandmother's jeans.
Well, I know. You're not.
Not quite
You're not
that
as
old.
old as I am. I don't know why I said that.
I don't either. I feel like I just aged 30 years.
I don't know. It just somehow felt like we should use the word dungarees.
She used garanimals, and I didn't have garanimals either. So
Our producer's getting a kick out of it.
So anyway, getting back
to our story, yeah. So all of that kind of continued on, and I think what I've heard you say before is you sort of took on the role of class clown a little bit to kind of mask, like you said, these strategies to sort of mask your insecurities or whatever around that, even as you got older. But is that
absolutely
is that accurate?
the strategy was to keep others from knowing what I couldn't do.
Right.
Because again, as a child, when you're trying to fit in with other children your age and be like them, and you see them excelling and you can't excel, and you're looking at a piece of paper and you're seeing words jump around on the piece of paper, and back then they didn't diagnose dyslexia.
Dyslexia, yeah.
No, and ADD. I mean, they told me that I was hyperactive and different things like. I mean, I knew that, but I didn't need a label to tell me that. But obviously we use labels today to and that's what
Can be
got
helpful.
me.
Yeah.
But the thing was I had every label. But the worst thing that was said to me, I think because of the way they treated me, was I was different, but that I was stupid. And I think that was the one thing, because I was hearing it from my older brother, who just loved to encourage me. He was the oldest, and he would encourage me with stuff like, "Hey, you're just stupid." And he wouldn't say that today, but at that time in my life, it was a part of what I heard. And when you hear something over and over and over,
Right.
you begin to believe
Yeah.
it. And I did. I believed it. And you've heard me say even in messages, what we believe is how we behave. And I took on the shame of not knowing how to read, and it became my identity. And it was because of what others really said about me. And I took that in and internalized it. And, of course, it carried me through. Because, just think about it just for a moment. When you're placed in a classroom that's not even a real classroom, It's a makeshift classroom on the way to the
Right.
bathrooms.
Mm-hmm.
And it was in between two long hallways, and it was put up with a couple of, some partitions and some desks, and that's where I would have to go. And that was, to me, it was, I would describe it today as devaluing. I didn't feel that. I mean, I couldn't articulate it at that time like that. I just knew that I was different, knew that people looked at me differently, and it wounded me, because of that.
Well, did you ever have, just as a little kid, was there something you were good at, or you thought, oh, I can do this? Like you saw yourself in some ways. I mean, not just as this as you're describing, but was there something you were good at, or your parents affirmed you in, where you got some balance out of that, or was it all just? I mean, are you remembering?
I was good at like things. My mother was the biggest encouragement. I mean, until she passed away in 2020, she was my biggest encouragement. She always encouraged me, and she told me I could do anything, and that's probably the one thing that kept me from probably getting worse in some areas of my life, and maybe going into some deep depression, because my mom always encouraged me. I played sports, played baseball. I raced bicycles, raced motorcycles.
And you trained horses.
I
too,
trained
didn't
horses.
You? So
Yeah, I
you
started-
had talents in other areas, and I
Yes,
just wondered
definitely.
if that was, if that helped to bolster
It did.
you
It did.
through those years.
Yeah, those were, I look at them today as they were definitely wins in my life, and helped.
And when school was hard, you knew those things were coming, and you could go
Right.
do those things in the afternoon, and you excelled in those areas.
Yes, and I started. I mean, at a very young age. I mean, I started working at 10 years old. I worked at a horse stables and cleaned stalls. Made $75 a week as a 10-year-old.
Wow, that is amazing.
And so, that's why I carried cash all the time. And my friends, I mean, it was like, the mafia had come to the school, because if I wanted candy, I'd buy it. If I bought candy, and I think that's, sometimes people, I think, hung around me because I had money and resources. and so it was one thing that I allowed that, though, almost to define me, because it became, I saw that as, because, I even later on, as I kept making money, I had a desire to make money, and I could do it.
Yeah.
And I knew how to do it, and I became pretty good at making money. And later
good.
on, I even started some businesses. I mean, when I was in high school, we'll talk about that in just a minute, but I was in high school, I started my own business. And, I was making more money than my teacher. That was one of the reasons it was a struggle for me to want to go to school, So,
Right.
yeah, I had a lot of things that I was good at. And that was the thing. And I think that's one of the issues with education today. It's more about information than it is education. And bringing the best out of each child. And they didn't recognize that I learned differently at that time.
Right.
And what they did with me is just put me aside or put me over here and just hopes, that I would get better. But I was socially promoted all the way through elementary school and middle school, and they would never do that today. But back then, he's going to get better. Just give him another year.
Yeah, thought you would get it.
Yeah, I thought I'd
when
get
you
it.
really weren't getting the
I
right
wasn't.
that
I
you
didn't
needed.
have any, foundational concepts. And the fact of the matter is, I could not read, and that has that's, if you can't read and you're sitting there in class and the words are jumping around on the page.
There's only so much you can
There's no
absorb.
comprehension.
Yeah.
So what I learned was through, it would be through memorization. I would memorize things that other people would say.
Yeah.
And
So you
that's-
were definitely an auditory learner
Absolutely.
through all that. But well, that's a lot of background. But so you didn't grow up in church, going to church as a
not at all.
family.
No.
And so you never really heard the gospel clearly until one day when James Merritt knocked on your door.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. I had never heard the gospel, and some people, I know they find that hard to believe, but there are people still today who haven't heard the gospel. and
Yeah.
they don't know what the gospel is.
Yeah.
And it's the good news, you know.
Right, right.
And the gospel is that Jesus died for our sin, and 3 days later he came up out of that grave as complete payment for our sin. That's the
right.
good news. And the bad news is we're all sinners. And I knew I didn't have to be told I was a sinner because I knew I had done wrong. I just didn't know that my sin had separated me from God and would keep me from heaven.
And you remember in that moment just kind of were you overwhelmed with that knowledge, or what was that? What was that like?
Well,
in that
going
moment?
back to the day, November 23rd, 1985, it's like it happened yesterday for me. I can remember that day, and I was outside working, doing something for my parents, and a couple of gentlemen drove up in the driveway, and I had never seen them before, but they were in a sports car. And now my mom was notorious for buying anything that came to the door. I mean, she would buy vacuum
Yeah.
cleaners at the door. I'm thinking, I'll just show them to the door. She'll buy something. They'll be on their way. Well, they didn't leave. And so about 30 minutes later, I decided to go inside. And I go inside, and my mom is crying. I'm thinking, why is she crying? And really, I'm thinking, what if she bought?
What have they done?
What have they done? What if she bought? What's making her cry? And I was a polite kid. My parents raised me to be polite, and so she introduced me to Dr. Merritt and Bob Thompson, who was the other gentleman who was a deacon at the church, and I said, it's nice to meet you. We sat down after the introduction, and I sat on the couch, and there he looked at me and he asked me a question I'd never been asked before. And since then, I've never been asked, which is an amazing thing that I still to this day, 30 plus years later, I've never been asked that question. And he looked at me and said, Russell, if you were to die today, would you go to heaven? And I thought, no, I've never thought about that. And
Never
especially
thought about
not
it.
today, not thinking about it.
Right.
And I'll be honest with you, I didn't know if he was getting ready to get a group up or not. I didn't know what he was doing.
Like, or do you want to go today?
Today? I mean, come on. And so, but he asked, and he said, would you like to know? And I got to tell you, something happened in that room. I could explain it today as the Holy Spirit, but at that time, I just knew there was something going on that I couldn't explain. It was more than just, my attention was captured. My
Right.
heart was about to bust out of
That's
my
amazing.
chest. Because you just know something. And this happened in a little house on 2672 Skyland Drive.
Yeah.
And as I tell people all the time, I'm sitting there on the ugliest couch in America.
we all remember those couches.
Yes. I mean, it had every brown bird
Yeah.
that was known to man.
I can see it.
Yes. And so, and here in this little den, he's sharing this track with me, and he could sense. He had the discernment to sense that I couldn't read. And so he was, and I thank God it had pictures. And so that was really good and really nice. And I don't. The good thing is I didn't remember seeing any flames of hell or anything like that. But the track was, "Do you know for sure?" That was and he had written this track, and so he was just going through the track and sharing with me what it meant to have a relationship with God through Jesus Christ, and about believing and receiving. And so that day, I had the good news. And then I understood the bad news is that my sin had separated me from God. And so
You got it.
You know.
You got it right then.
I got it then. I
Yes.
did. And so, I believed and received that day. And I'm telling you, I knew, I knew something was different, And my mom, she's over there crying again. And I thought, my mom had been so gracious to me and so giving to me, and I at times was so terrible. If she didn't give enough, or I would say things to her that were just horrible. And I'll never forget. I would tell her, because my love for her was based on what she would give to me, not because she was my mother sometimes. And so I would say, I hate you at times when I'd get heated arguments and stuff like that. Usually it was probably my fault most of the time. And she would look at me and she said, "But Russell, I love you."
Oh.
And that day I saw something that, I knew she had a new son.
Mm.
And the reason I would know that would be the next day. And so the next day, this is a Saturday, so the next day is Sunday. And, he looks at me and says, look, explains to me about baptism, explains to me about, public profession your faith through
Right.
that baptism. And I said, yes, sir, whatever I need to do. And I remember my mom took me to one of the men's clothing shop, the Gentry shop in Snellville. Yeah, she knew the men at the Gentry shop because my dad owned a body shop and he fixed a lot of people's cars, and they were customers, I believe. But I remember going to Russ's place and she bought me a sport coat and some pants.
Wow.
And
They were going to be ready to
She
go
ready.
to First Baptist.
she did. We were going to the
Yes,
First
yes.
Baptist.
yes.
And so I did, and something happened that morning that I wasn't expecting. It was somebody that I would see on my way to Sunday school. I had never been to Sunday school. I didn't know what Sunday school was. So I'm on my way to Sunday school, and I see this girl, and her name's Cheryl. And Cheryl was someone that I had, again, because of my insecurities and just because I was just, bottom line, I was a jerk, before I got saved in a lot of ways. I talked about Cheryl in a lot of derogatory ways and made her cry and things like that. And so
That's
here,
just hard to believe now.
I know.
and here she is as a, this person that I have talked about. Here she has encountered me, and this is how I knew that God had changed me, and would continue to change me. But I knew that something happened to me. I looked at her and I said, Cheryl, if you could find a place in your heart to forgive me, would you please forgive me? And she looked back at me without any hesitation. She said, Russell, I've been praying for you to get saved.
My goodness.
And
That's amazing.
And of course, I didn't know what to do other than just thank her. But what I knew is, why didn't I do that before?
Right.
Because
right.
I didn't have the conviction of the Holy Spirit to do that before.
Right.
I didn't have a changed life. I didn't have a new heart. And so God put inside of you a new heart. That's what he says in 2 Corinthians 5:17. Therefore, if any man be in Christ, he's a new creation. Old things pass away. Behold, all things become new. I was becoming new in Christ. And that was evident. And I think that was one of the reasons that it became so real to me, is because I saw it lived out in real time. And then it just progressed from there.
Yeah.
Other people would, that I would come in contact with, would experience the same thing. People I had to ask for forgiveness, people that I made things right with,
Right.
and so forth. So,
Well, that's a beautiful testimony. And the fact that you had enough wisdom, too, as just a young teenager to realize, even if the Spirit prompted you, but to have the courage, to say that to people, to ask for forgiveness, to know that that's something you ought to do. Because I think even sometimes as older people, if we've wronged someone, I mean, it's hard to, to go and say, I'm sorry, would you forgive me, even for things. So that's...
well, I know this is getting ahead of the story, but I may forget about it. We may not cover it. But, later on, I would pastor Cheryl.
Yes.
And which was one of them. I was sharing my
amazing.
testimony at our church at the time, the church I was pastoring at the time. And I see Cheryl in the audience. And I'm telling you, I lost it. I lost it. And Starla remembers that day.
And then she ended up working at a grocery store, grocery store that we would use.
Yeah, she stayed in our church for a while, and then she moved away.
She did.
And then she passed away
of COVID.
of
She died of
COVID.
COVID.
Yeah.
Oh,
And so, but it was just, I'm telling you,
well, that's a beautiful
It's a full.
story.
It was
it
a
was
full circle.
you know.
Yes.
And that was so amazing how God would bring people from my past to my future.
Right.
And
And then you got to pastor her. You got to be her pastor.
got to be her pastor,
Yeah.
and I was the one who talked so ugly to her.
Yeah.
So it's full circle
He can-
grace.
he can do
you know, and it's just the power of God. God can.
Yeah.
We can't do it in our own power, and that's why I didn't do it, because
Right.
repentance is a change of mind, and what I had to do, salvation was based on first of all believing and receiving. You can't work for it. but you have to change your mind to realize there's nothing you can do to receive it. It's all the work of God. And as a result of the work of God, I always like to say the object of your faith has to be Jesus, because he's the only one who can make the change.
Right.
That's right. Well, then, so those years kind of rocked along, and then we'll move forward a little bit. But then you had a chance to travel with someone very interesting and learn a lot along the way. So tell us about that time when you traveled with Rick Stanley,
well,
who he is.
Sure. The way that I met Rick is, of course, I went on through, being socially promoted, and then got into high school. Well, they fail you when you don't make the grades. They have a different system. So I was going on my third year in ninth grade, and just trying to get to know my teachers a little better, and I didn't imagine I would be. Matter of fact, it was so embarrassing because my little sister caught up with me, and I would tell people that was my cousin, not my sister, because again, it was just embarrassing.
Yeah.
But after I got saved, all the things that I'd done prior to getting saved caught up with me. All the times going to the principal's office, and so it was accumulation of things. But there was a situation where I actually went to the principal's office, and of course ended up being kicked out of school as a result of my encounter. I don't know if you want to share my encounter, but I was kicked out of school, but not just that school in that county, Gwinnett, but every school in the state. So obviously I had a lot of time on my hands, and I had gone to a summer camp, and my first summer camp ever. I'd never been to a summer camp. Went to a summer camp, and yes, there was an evangelist by the name of Rick Stanley. And for those who listen and don't know what an evangelist is, someone who just travels, with an itinerant schedule, speaking to different churches. So he was preaching at the camp, and he took an interest in me at camp.
And tell who he is.
Are you going to get into that? Sure, yeah. Elvis, he was Elvis Presley's stepbrother. And my mom was an Elvis fanatic. She loved Elvis. And so, Rick took a liking to me at that time, and really began he saw a lot of himself in me, because he had a lot of the same struggles that I did growing up as well. And so he spent some time with me, and then later on, he asked me, he said, won't you come? I remember he was doing a tent revival at Pleasant Hill Baptist Church. Dr. Frank Cox is the pastor, and it was over, they were at their location off of Pleasant Hill Road at the time, before they had moved. And so I went to this tent revival, and he asked me that night to go on the road. He said, would you like to travel with me? And I'm just blowing my mind, because I knew I didn't have school anymore. Right. So I could do
Sounds
this.
Sounds like a great opportunity.
I could do this. And, prior to that, I told you earlier, I had started my own business, a car wash business called Porter Wash. That's when I was making more money than my teachers. So I had stopped really doing that, and just was just thinking, because when I was saved, everything changed for me. My desire for making money wasn't the same. So I just was studying the Bible as much as I could, with anyone's help that would give me. Anybody who helped me, I was like a sponge. Oh. And so Rick, he said, look, would you like to travel with me? So I go home, and I tell my mom that Elvis Presley's stepbrother wants to take me on the road.
I can imagine how that went over.
But she was like, really? I said, yeah, it's real. He's really Elvis's stepbrother. And
they were really more like brothers,
yes,
though.
Right. Absolutely.
Thing, right?
And so, he said, I need you to meet me in Mississippi for my first one. It was Crystal Springs, Mississippi. So my mom drives me to Crystal Springs, Mississippi to drop me off with Rick. And
you were 18?
I was 17.
17.
17.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah,
because Rick lived in Florida.
Yeah, Rick lived in Florida. Yeah. And so, just think I'm dropping my 17-year-old, out of state. It was either that or a bus ride, and I'd been on a Greyhound before. Later, I would ride on some Greyhounds. And so those kinds of things were, unheard of that time. You definitely would be more cautious doing that today. I
Yeah.
wouldn't put my 30-year-old
On a Greyhound.
on a Greyhound. But
Yeah.
so yes, I met him in Crystal. I met him there at the revival meeting, and then I would travel and stay on the road with him. And then in between, when we were off, he would put me up at a place in Fort Walton Beach where he lived, and we just carried. I would stay on the road with him, and so and he began to again teach me a lot of things about the Bible, obviously, but he taught me how to read.
How to read. That's
And-
amazing that what do you think it was about him what did he unlock that had not been
That's a good
unlocked
question.
before?
I think he listened to me, the way that I learned, and he recognized I was uniquely gifted and different things, and it wasn't an issue of intelligence. It was just an issue of how my brain was working, and so
And maybe his worked similarly.
Yeah,
so
I
he
think so.
might have been able to.
Yes.
I think so.
Yeah.
So he had, he had a lot of interest in me because of that. I think because of his own struggles. So, and he had gone through, Criswell Bible College, Southwestern Seminary, and so he was,
Just poured into you.
poured into
Yeah.
me. And so one of the funny things is what he would do is I'd learn by repetition. It didn't matter if it was
Okay.
a book by Charles Stanley, because I would pick up the big books and I'd go for the hard stuff. And
That's
I'd
good.
find the big words.
Yeah.
And I didn't know what any of these words would mean. And he would tell me what they'd mean. And so we would have a word of the day. And I would use that word as many times that day as I could. And I used it probably more times than he wanted me to. And I'll never forget, we'd go to dinner with these pastors. And these pastors had no idea of our plan and our scheme. And they probably think I'm educated from, the
Throwing out
seminary.
these big
I'm
words.
throwing out these big words and, ecclesia. No, I didn't throw out ecclesia at the time. But I was throwing out these big words. And wax and eloquence. And of course, I still am learning to read. But I learned how to have a conversation
Yeah,
with people
yeah.
with the words that I learned. And it worked, but not only worked, but it was teaching me something. And then and so just the attention that he gave me made a huge difference.
The
Yeah.
time and the patience, because they did have a lot of time together, because most of the, church events were at night.
Yeah.
So during the day, they might be, doing things with the pastor and such, but it was a lot of time. It was patience. It was, being intentional about, like you said, the word of the day and those types of things. And I think more than anything, Russ just felt a comfort level.
Yeah.
And, school is at a pace, and everybody has to
Right.
keep the same pace, and this was on his pace.
And he was really like a big brother in so many ways. He really was, because he kind of treated me like a little brother.
Yeah.
And we stayed, in the same hotel rooms, and so I was his coffee boy.
Yeah. Yeah. You were
His
Aaron.
money
Yeah,
man.
I was carrying the
money.
money bag, and he taught me how to
Just
put the
whatever
money
you-
bag in my back.
Well, you learned a lot of things during that time,
I
and
did.
just somebody to believe in you too. Whereas
Right.
all these others had said, you can't do this or
Right.
whatever, and then
Right.
it's just that one. Sometimes it just takes one.
That's right.
And that
Yes.
that probably
Absolutely,
changed that
absolutely.
trajectory.
Well,
for
I
you,
think
too.
when someone shows or assigns value to you intentionally, and
Right.
that's what he did.
Right.
He added value to my life every day. There was something he would do or say to add value to me. He really did. It was an extraordinary thing, and I miss him. He's been in heaven now for a few years.
I was going to ask, is he still? Is he
He's
still with us, but
he's
passed
alive,
away? Yeah.
just not here.
Not down here with us.
In his glorified body.
That's right. Well, we're kind of hitting the highlights, but we'll move along a little bit because there is another interesting aspect of your story. So you met Starla.
Yes.
Y'all married. She already
Right.
kind of gave us a little background, but so the two of y'all were traveling, doing revivals, events, all that. There was one particular day, y'all were on vacation with your family, Russ, and Take us back to that fateful day.
Well, it was August the 15th, 1998, and Starla was pregnant with Karis, our daughter, and we would go on vacation with my parents because we were in evangelism as well on the road, and we were broke, and we couldn't buy anything. So my parents were so gracious they would say, "Hey, come stay with us at the beach for a few days." And so that's what we did. We were on our way. We had to be in Tifton, Georgia on Sunday. So I believe we went probably on a Friday or Thursday or Friday, something like that. We'd stay a couple of days, and then we would head on to Tifton. It was and the thing about the beach, I don't like the beach. I don't like sand. I don't like sand getting on me, and so I like looking at it. I like playing in the water, but that's about the extent of the beach. So normally, if we would go on vacation like that, I would go golfing, and she said, "Hey, why don't you come down and play on the beach with Crosby?" And that was our son. And so I said, okay. And so
and it was a short day because we were
traveling.
Going to be out there in the morning, eat some lunch, and then head out to go back to Tifton to prepare for Sunday. So there wasn't enough time to really play golf, but anyway, and I had been still sick in my pregnancy, and I was dragging a lot. Crosby was 4, and so I just said, if you could just come and just kind of play with him at the beach, that would be so helpful.
Yeah, she wanted me to come so he would throw sand on me and not her. Remember, he's 4 years old. And he's not making sandcastles, he's just throwing it everywhere. So I did. I went down there and I got in the water after, sometime on the beach playing with him. I was going to go rinse off because obviously I had sand on me. And I told my dad, we'd been out in the water for a little bit, floating around. I said, "Dad, I'm gonna get out, go get a shower, and we're gonna get ready to leave." And it's amazing how you can say what you're gonna do in a plan, and then that plan never happened or changed drastically. And so I decided the quickest way for me to get back to the beach was to ride a wave on my belly, just body surf back. I'm not a professional body surfer. I had not been one. It was just laziness. I decided not to walk and to ride it in. So I got on top of this wave, and it was a beautiful day, and the water was calm. But we were out kind of in an area where it was a sandbar, and then, you'd kind of get some deeper water, and then it would be shallow again.
Right.
And so I was in a shallow area, probably waist deep. Decided to get up on a wave, and as soon as I got up on top of the wave flipped me over and just slammed my head into the bottom. And interesting enough, it had happened already one other time where I hit the front of my head, and it really hurt. This time, it slammed me almost like someone took me by my feet and slammed me head first, and the top of my head hit the bottom so hard. I came up out of the water screaming, and all I could do is go to the pain. And you know how something hurts on you, just go to that pain, grab it or something. So I just grabbed my neck, not knowing what I was doing, just grabbed it because of the pain, walked, got up, and of course walked out of the water. Because my dad, I was screaming for him, but I don't remember him. He may have been close to me and helping me along the way, but I don't remember much of that. But I don't think he was helping me that much. I just got to the beach. I laid down, and Starla was over still with Crosby, and because she didn't know if I was goofing off, playing, because I can be a prankster.
Because you're a prankster.
Yes, for our listeners that don't know Russ, he's quite a character. So I just, he was kind of waving his arms out there, but he was walking, and so I thought he'd been stung by jellyfish. And I knew that once he got to shore that maybe we could, go to the lifeguard and tend to it, whatever. But I didn't want Crosby to see if it was something serious. I kept him distracted.
So my mom came over there, and then I said, "Mom, call an ambulance. I am hurt." And then a lady who I'd never seen before,
She was just walking down the beach.
Just walking down the beach. She knelt down beside me, and she said, "I'm a nurse. Just stay still." And I said, "Well, I can't move."
Can't do
and what I
anything
meant by it is,
that.
I knew my head felt like it was going to fall off my shoulders. I mean, there was no support. It felt like if I sat up, my head would just fall forward, you know. And so, and I looked at her and I said, "Ma'am, when will I be paralyzed?" Because I knew it was bad.
Because you said from training the horses, you knew, you were familiar with spinal cord injury.
I was.
I mean,
I'd seen people get hurt.
Yeah, you felt like you knew that was coming.
And I had done some really crazy things, wrecked motorcycles and all different kinds of things. But this was a pain that I had never had before. And so the ambulance came. They, put me on a board, wrapped me up, put duct tape on my head, secured me, took me off. And when I was in the back of the ambulance, the paramedic said, "Son, you've probably just sprained your neck." He said, because people that are paralyzed, he said, I've taken people out of this water who are already dead because they're paralyzed. They couldn't swim back. He said, "You're probably you'll be home by tonight. You'll be all right." I wished he would have been, obviously accurate with his assessment. But as we were heading to the hospital, it seemed like it took forever. I mean, it did. It's a matter of fact, there were no lights.
No, they didn't turn the lights on.
They
stopped at every red light.
I thought that they were stopping at McDonald's. And
Felt like that.
I thought Starla was doing a mini concert up front. I didn't have a clue what was going on, but it seemed like it.
It did. It took about 30 minutes.
Yeah, and it only takes 45 to fly from Atlanta to Panama City.
Goodness.
And it took that long to get to the. So we don't know why it took so long, but when we got there, they wheeled me in and parked me in the hallway, and said, "We've got to take him to another hospital, because he has to have an MRI. And the operator, there's no operator. This is on the weekend. There's nobody to operate an MRI." And I'm thinking, oh my gosh. So they've got to put me back in the ambulance, take me in. And I'm stoked. I mean, I'm grossly unstable at this point. They get me finally back to the hospital where I started and take me into I'm in the emergency room, take me into an area. And they park me again. And I wait and I wait and I wait, and I finally hear them say, "We can take him back. He has insurance." I actually heard that. And I'm like, okay. So they get me back, and someone, I don't know who it was, but someone began to take the blocks from my neck to get x-rays. And they started pulling on my neck. And I was screaming.
Oh, my goodness.
And Starla was out to where she
I had been registering, doing all the paperwork and everything, and I could hear him from where I was up in the lobby area, and I didn't know what was happening.
And then what did you hear next with the doctor?
So when I finally was able to go back there, the doctor had come in, and he said, "Mr. Harbin, I need you to know."
No, I'm talking about they reprimanded the.
Oh, yes. Yeah. They reprimanded whoever it was, a physician or a student or whoever it was. And they said, "You don't ever, take cervical blocks off of somebody that has a possible cervical injury." And, so then that was quite
Sorry, then
scary.
Go ahead, and she said, and then the doctor walked in.
Yes. And so then the doctor walked in, and he said, "Mr. Harbin," he said, "you've broken your neck in 4 places." And he said, "You're not going anywhere tonight, and we're going to send you straight up to ICU because we're concerned that because of the swelling, it's going to cut off the breathing center. And so we're going to have to monitor you closely." And of course, by then they were taking care of his pain and trying to get him settled. Now he's got sand still all over his body. He's still in his, he's still in his swim trunks at this point until I think they got him up to ICU and got him settled.
And all those breaks were in C1.
Is
that correct?
C1 was broken. I think it was 5 places total. It was shattered.
Goodness.
I mean, it like they had to take bone from my. They would end up having to take bone from my hip because of how much bone was missing.
And the ligament on one side was
Transverse ligament was gone.
completely gone.
Wow. And so that's why you were so unstable.
Yes.
But, and I guess with me being a therapist and being familiar with spinal cord injury as well, there's a saying, C3, 4, and 5 keeps the diaphragm alive.
Yes.
So anything, above there,
yeah.
you're there or above, you're not
Right.
going to breathe. And I mean, it just like to me to hear that it was shattered, the transverse ligament broken, that it's shattered in 4 or 5 places, and that in all the movement that you'll talk about, even the more movement that had to go on, that it was just amazing. Nothing shifted, nothing, in such a way that it's going to transect that cord.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, they could have killed me in the ER.
At any point, it could have gone.
Because of how unstable everything was. And, and so...
then they kind of had to decide what to do because we didn't know if he would have a halo or if he would have surgery or, what the plan was. But they were basically going to treat the emergent things first and make sure that he was going to, breathe and all of those things. And so then they came up with a plan.
Yeah, and Dr. Stringer was his name. And I've said this before, and it really didn't hit me until later on in life. But Dr. Stringer probably saved my life because he didn't try to do a surgery that he couldn't do.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I really, to me, that's one of the greatest for recognizing limitations and he did. He said, there's only 2 doctors that I know of that can do the surgery that you need. One's in Atlanta, one's in Chicago. And so we obviously opted for Atlanta, and we had such wonderful insurance. And so we had to buy our own. My mom went and made arrangements for a commuter plane, just a little puddle jumper, to get us back to Atlanta, because they wouldn't pay for a medical flight, and they wouldn't even pay for an ambulance to get me from the airport
to Atlanta. Yeah,
just going in regular sort of vehicles like
Yes.
we would just
So-
if you weren't hurt or
Yes,
anything.
so-
Just
so
that's
again-
right. And he had not walked in 3 days, and so the hospitalist would say that he
How's he
can't get on a plane. He hasn't even been out of the bed, and he said, watch me. I mean, you know how he is.
Yeah.
So he did it. And it was one of the kind that, you didn't come down the terminal. You had to climb up the steps to get in the plane.
goodness.
And he had we had luggage, people throwing out luggage over our heads. Somebody hit the back of his seat. And all he had on was this 4-poster collar.
That's it.
And it was something. So when we landed in Atlanta, his cousin
Had to pick us up
picked us up in her minivan.
and ride us on 285, which will kill
Oh
you.
boy.
You know,
Yeah, for those of you not
imagine-
in Georgia, just imagine.
Imagine how nervous
the worst
she was.
thing you can imagine as far as traffic,
and
you
she
got
felt
it.
so. I mean, the pressure she felt of trying to be. I mean, again, I'm sitting here with a broke neck, and she's trying to get me to the hospital for me to, to have surgery, and so we get to Emory University, and we're greeted outside the hospital, where they drive us up, or drop me off. That we're greeted by, I think, 3 doctors, and they were just. I mean, it was I just thought, this is amazing. They're out here greeting us, and Dr. Haid was going to be the surgeon who would operate, and he didn't meet us out there, but they got us.
His team did.
His team did. They got us in the room, and he walked in a very confident way. He just looked and he said, "I just need to know one thing: how did you walk out of the water?"
Well, he said, how did you make it out?
Yeah,
of the
how did you
water?
make
you
it out of the
make
water?
it?
That's right. How did
Yeah.
you make it out of the water? He said, there's no possible way you walked out of the water. He said, I've looked at the x-rays, seen the MRI. There's no medical way you walked out of the water. How'd you do it? I said, well, I'm here. And so he said, there must have been a mighty force with you. And Starla spoke up and she said, no, sir, it was the hand of God. And he received that well. And
That might have been what he meant, but
Yeah.
he just couldn't say
Well, and there
it.
was such
Maybe, I
a
don't know.
realization in that
Yeah.
moment because we were really with the right person that
Right.
could really bring it all, in focus for us as to really how serious it was.
Yeah.
And what was unfolding before us was a miracle. And, and even going into the surgery, he could have paralyzed him, even just by the surgery. So there were still high risk, but he was too unstable to not do anything.
Right.
So we
He had
knew
to do
that,
something.
to be able to move forward with his life, but
Yeah,
there was
Halo
still
wouldn't
risk.
have actually worked
Yeah.
because there was bone missing.
You had to-
so much bone
Yeah,
missing.
Right, it
You
had to be
get it
really
back together.
recreated and strengthened with plates and bone and
But
all those
so
things.
with none of this, you didn't ever have any little sensory thing like my toes numb or
No.
my, or I can't. Feel a little weak in one. I mean, nothing, no sensory or motor thing that happened at all, and that's just amazing.
It is amazing.
with those breaks and where it was. That,
Well, what would we find out later? Because he looked at us and he said, "I've got some good news and bad news first. What would you like?" I said, "At this point, it really doesn't matter." And he said, "Well, the bad news is you've broken your neck in C1 and C2." And he said, "That's it's better known as the Hangman's fracture or the Jefferson fracture, I think they call it." And he said, or there was two different types. And he said, he said, "You have the same injury as Christopher Reeves, just like he broke his neck." He said, "The good news is I can put it back together and you're going to live a normal life." And of course, at that time, I didn't, those words, the normal life did not all set in at that point. But we were just amazed that God had spared me at 28 years old. And of course, we've got a baby girl about to be born.
and that was one thing I think you skipped that. That was your one prayer
On the
coming
beach.
off the beach.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Going back to I was on the beach and I didn't ask God to heal me, even though I know He can and He does. I just said, "Lord, if you'll just allow me to hold my baby girl, just give me my arms to work. If I'm in a wheelchair, that's fine. Just give me my arms so I can hold her when she comes in a few months." And so. That was what I prayed, and then the surgery I had the surgery. I was there for I think 4 or 5 days, and then went home and was in the bed for 3 months in recovery with that. And you don't realize how heavy your head is. I have a small head, by the way. My head is
You always say that,
I
but it
do.
doesn't look small. to
well,
me.
well, I'm wearing youth glasses. If that gives you any indication. Sam's much better pricing, by the way. It's so, and the average head weighs, they say, 8 pounds. I've seen some watermelons that are a lot bigger than that. But if you can just imagine how you can't, I couldn't even lift my head off my pillow.
Yeah.
Because they would, the way the surgery was, obviously would affect the muscles that would control all of that, and everything, because of the surgery, everything would have to start over, and I would have to relearn a lot of things. I had a hard time swallowing. She actually had to crush the medicine completely up, and I almost had to take it almost like it was all crushed completely, and so. Because the pills were huge.
Well, you
Yeah.
have so much swelling.
Well,
too,
and you
just-
can't, when you swallow a pill, you kind of lean your head back. You
Right.
probably couldn't.
No,
you couldn't
'cause it
do
was
that.
all
Yeah.
Well, I
restricted
could, and
for
I
the
couldn't
breast.
lift my head.
Yeah.
It wasn't until weeks later that I could actually begin to lift my head off the pillow, because I just laid there in the bed and looked up. But God's hand was in it from the beginning through, and it just goes to show you again the sovereignty of God, even with people's incompetence, even with people's mistakes, even with people's disregard for different things. God was in control of all of them.
That's right.
And because He had a purpose, and His purpose for me was to walk again. That's hard, because at times since then I've been with people who had the same injury as I
Right.
do, and they're quadriplegic,
Yeah.
or they're paralyzed, from the waist down, so
Yeah.
it's hard. Matter of fact, I went to play golf one time after my surgery and obviously recovery a couple of years later. And I'm playing golf with this fella, and he said, I've heard your story. And I said, you have? And he said, yeah. He said, I can relate to it. He said, my son is in a wheelchair. And, and I just had to go back to, really God, all he needs is our heart.
Yeah.
That's the most important thing. If he has our heart, he has everything he needs.
Right. That's what I was going to say. When I heard you say, God he could have used me in a wheelchair. He wanted to use me out of a wheelchair. He can use people in chairs,
Absolutely.
wheelchairs, and out
And he
of
does,
wheelchairs,
every
but
day.
he needs our heart, and that's what he needs.
It needs our heart, absolutely.
So tell us about, so you're recovered. Tell us about that moment you got to hold your baby girl.
Well, it took me, it was about
4 months.
4 months. And that was where I'd go for this checkup, and he would tell me, he said, well, you can drive. And so that was the best news I'd had, because I
and
could,
the scariest news I had.
Yes, she did. She got,
Because I was great with child.
Yeah.
and I could only turn at my shoulders.
I was going to say, did you have to kind of
Yes.
do the whole
Yes.
motion?
So
People
when he
can't see
said,
us.
he said, because I actually wore this bone stimulator. It was a new technology
Okay.
at the time. And if we would participate in the program, they wouldn't charge anything for it. And so it was almost like a device that I wore it on my neck every day, and it helped stimulate the growth of the bone. Well, by the 3-month period, it had completely closed up, healed, and that's when he told me, he said, look, you can go do whatever you want. Now, he said, now let me tell you what I wouldn't do. I wouldn't go snow skiing. I wouldn't water ski.
Ever.
Ever. And what he meant by that, he said, because the only way that I can go back in is to save your life. So, you don't need just to fall.
Just a repair.
You don't get a
and
redo.
you
Right,
don't
right.
get a redo. So he said, I can't go back in unless it's just to save your life. Because, you could, at that point, my life could end again because of just another surgery. And so I understood that. I said, but give me the keys. I told her, I said, give me the keys. I'm driving home. And we were in Atlanta. Can
Lord.
you just imagine? And I remember this car we had. We had a Cutlass, a 1988 Cutlass Sierra. And I'm telling you, I drove that thing like NASCAR out of the parking lot. I was so thankful to get the keys and drive. And because I'd been in the bed for 3 months. But we go home, and we're still recovering, and so Starla is telling me, look, I think this is it for me to deliver Karis, and so we're getting ready. And so I told her, she tells the story all the time. She said, he had to do his fingernails, and she told me the night before, she said, you need to get gas tonight because something could happen. And I said, oh, we'll be fine. Well, I had to stop to get gas.
And I was in labor.
And she was in labor.
Yes.
And so she said, this is it. I said, you sure? And that's
So he
one
cut
thing.
his
I cut my
fingernails,
fingernails.
and
And that's one thing I've learned. You don't argue with a woman in labor.
Right.
It could be,
Probably not
I could
good.
have actually had my neck broken again. So,
Wring your neck.
yes, wring my neck. So she, of course, was preparing me for what was happening. So we make our way to the hospital. We get there, and obviously have this beautiful baby girl. And, the thing that it's still overwhelming. I'll probably...
It's okay. We will too. It's all right. We're
You're in
already
great
starting.
company.
Right.
But, the thing that a mother longs for is to hold her baby because she's carried it the whole
right.
time. And there's a bond that a mother has that a father doesn't have, and that's just because God created it that way. And because it was in her womb. And so the first thing she did without any hesitation, when Karis came out, she said, they said, who do I give her to? And she said, he holds her first. And just remembering what I prayed, asking God to let me hold my baby girl. And here I was able to hold her. I was a little stiff, but
And your neck was about the size of a broom handle. It was so skinny.
It was.
Because he had just gotten out of that, collar and everything.
So my head did look bigger at that time.
Well, y'all can't see us, but we're all crying. We all got tears. Oh, just thinking of that prayer, and he sustained you, and he allowed that to be. I mean, that's just so beautiful.
Well, and just from my
Starla.
heart, though, you just don't pass over what the Lord does. And, we had I had the rest of my life to hold her, and so at that moment, it was just it was a God moment because of, and we named her Charis, which means grace in the Greek, because the Lord's grace had just been poured out over our lives. And, it was just a culmination of all those things in that moment. And so it was a really sweet time.
But Starla was just think about it. When I think about just the humility and again, her appreciating the moment, but, she put me first.
Right, even her young self.
That's
She
right.
might do that now, but I don't know about when I think about what I was like at 26 or 7. Like, I don't know.
I probably would have done it again. Thank you for joining us today. May the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you all.